I want to start in perhaps an unusual place. The reason I want to begin with a story is because when we talk about things like aesthetic experience, aesthetic taste, beauty, and these kinds of ideas, we often think of it as either something that's for the elite, or something that isn't really necessary. It's like window dressing, or if you have the extra money or means, then sure, add some aesthetics or whatever. But I want to start with a story from Primo Levi's book, If This Is a Man, which tells about one day while he was a prisoner in Auschwitz. He and a fellow prisoner had to walk across the camp to get the food for their group for that day. So, of course, if you're in that situation, you take the most circuitous route possible. And as they start walking, Primo Levi begins to recite passages of Dante. And it becomes immediately clear that his fellow prisoner had never read Dante. So it gets him even more excited to share this with him. And so as he gets to, he starts quoting, and then he gets to a point and he can't remember a particular connecting line. And so he starts over again, and nothing works. He can't seem to remember. And so he says something pretty extreme. He said, "I would have given up my day's food just to remember this." Now, keep in mind, this is a concentration camp. This is not like, oh, I skipped breakfast, now I can have a gigantic lunch. This is it. This is his one piece of food for the day, and he was willing to give it up, and he's already probably starving. And a few paragraphs later, he explains why. He says, "Because for a brief moment, I forgot who I was and where I was." And to me, that's like indicative and of just the absolute power of beauty for our lives, that in such an awful place, like he didn't need to wait till things were going good. Things were not going good. He tapped into it right away. And so I have this talk in 3 parts. What is beauty? I focus on beauty, even though the talk is on aesthetic experience more broadly, but I focus on beauty because it's sort of the queen of the aesthetic properties, but also because we have this idea. If I were to ask, like, what's a memory of beauty that you can remember? Most people say something that's really lofty. Most people don't say, "Oh, there was this brush I used to own that was pretty beautiful." Usually it's something bigger. But beauty is a gradation. It's not just like these top experiences that are what we might think of as the exemplary experiences. There's a gradation of it. So it's going to be mostly, when I say lessons from history and science, it's mostly lessons from history of philosophy, but in Western philosophy at that, and with a little bit of science right at the end, to kind of draw the connection. Then, is aesthetic experience a basic human good? And then part 3, I just want to give you the heads up. Part 1 is the longest. So if it seems like, wow, there's no way he's going to finish on time, no, it's by design. Part 1, there's way too much to cram into like 10 minutes, so it has to be the longest part. So let's jump into the history of philosophy. We go back to ancient Greece, and if you've ever read Plato's Symposium, which is one of his most famous, not just works of philosophy, but works of literature. People often think it's just a great work of literature, even if you're not interested in the philosophy part of it. It's Socrates and like a few other, like 5 other guys that decide, let's drink and give speeches on love. I mean, we've all been there. When Socrates goes last, and when it finally comes to his turn, he recounts. He's usually the one that questions everybody. If you know anything about Socrates, but now he brings in Diotima, he recounts his conversation with Diotima, and she is the one questioning him, which is kind of a cool turn of events if you're used to Socrates being the one trapping people in rhetoric and such on. Anyway. And she explains that first, with beauty, you experience the beauty of a physical body. And then you experience the beauty of multiple physical bodies. And then from there, you move up, you ascend to the beauty of ideas. And eventually you make your way to the beauty with a capital B. So Plato had this idea or this view that there are these forms that exist in some immaterial realm, and form with a capital F, beauty with a capital B here, goodness with a capital G, and so so on. And that's what everything that exists. That's where it gets its nature from, this perfect realm. And so you ascend through knowledge, like a rising staircase, Diotima says. So for Plato, beauty is connected with love and knowledge. Knowledge because it requires knowledge to get to the higher levels, and love because the object of beauty is something that, if it's an object, something you want to possess. If it's a person, it's someone you want to be with or know. And so I think that's an important point, but it ultimately, beauty is grounded in this perfect idea in some immaterial realm. So moving on to Aristotle, Aristotle claims that beauty consists of order, proportion, and definiteness. Now, I'll just jump to proportion because it's sort of the easiest. It's the relationship of parts. Many of you are designers, you know that. So that doesn't need to, it doesn't need much explanation. But for order, Aristotle was very much connected with the idea of functional beauty, or beauty is an aspect of function, and which I think resonates with designers and architects. And order, and also for Aristotle, there's an order to nature. And he gives this example of, if you sort of were walking in the woods and came upon a heap of bricks, you assume that someone, dumped them there from a wheelbarrow, and that someone did not, carefully assemble this thing to look like a disordered heap. Now, if you're in an art gallery, that's a different story. But like in the middle of the woods, or at someone's backyard or something, you assume that someone just dumped it. But if you come across the same amount of bricks, but they're somehow assembled into, maybe a knee-high wall that forms a square or something, you assume someone did that wasn't accidental. And so that's all he means by order, to kind of get the idea going. And if you see this image here, the one pointing up is Plato, the one kind of pointing out is Aristotle, and that represents their metaphysics, basically, their views of reality. Plato is pointing up to the forms, Aristotle is pointing to reality and saying we learn what beauty is from experience. We learn what a tree is just from experiencing trees, and so on. And then a couple hundred years later, Plotinus, apparently proportion became too important. And so Plotinus is there to say, well, proportion can't be the only attribute of beauty, because proportion requires that there are at least two parts. But what about simple things that have one part? That they couldn't be beautiful if proportion is required. Now we might disagree with that assessment, but that's what he was saying. But Plotinus had this view that if something is beautiful, then all of its parts must be beautiful. We know from art that it's possible to make something composed of ugly parts and turn it into something beautiful. We might think of Monet, like going up close and looking at the different dabs of paint might not be very attractive, but standing back and seeing the whole thing might be, more attractive. But Plotinus was the first follower of Plato, essentially. And Plotinus is one of the first people to really connect beauty with ethics, but I won't get into that for this one. I thought that's just an interesting fact. So jumping ahead into the Middle Ages. I told you this is a crash course. So it's a selective narrative. We start with St. Augustine in the beginning, in around 300. And he says, beauty is truth that is known and contemplated by the intellect and loved by the will as the good of the intellect. Beauty, truth, and goodness were this, trinity of, properties that were part of everything that exists. Something that is ugly, something that is false, something that is evil, it's a privation of those three things. And so Augustine, you can see the connection with Plato right away. Augustine, has been sometimes loosely described as a Christian Plato. There's some truth to that, but probably not. Probably that's too simple. And Plato's the one on the top, and Aquinas is the one on the bottom of the images. Uh, but he talks about it's contemplated by the intellect. So he brings in this cognitive component to the experience of beauty, and then also the connection with truth and goodness. Now, skipping to about 1,000 years later to Thomas Aquinas, he says beauty is, if he were to give a definition, the closest thing he gave was beauty is that which pleases when seen. This definition is highly misleading. But I will say, when we talk about the argument about whether beauty is objective or subjective, most of the people prior to modern philosophy, such as the ancient and medieval philosophers, most of them are thought to have an idea of the objectivity of beauty. But I want to point out that here in Aquinas's quote unquote definition, beauty is that which pleases. So he connects pleasure, which is a subjective experience. He connects it with pleasure right away. And then when he says when seen, it's more of it's not just glance, like you look over, something beautiful. It's more like seen in the mind's eye. So it connects with the idea of contemplation. It's not just like glanced or seen or something as it may sound in English. But he does say something interesting. He says there are 3 conditions of beauty: proportion, integrity, and radiance. Proportion, as I said, parts to the whole. You got that part. You got that one. The only thing I would say is, like, proportion as applied to music is what we usually call harmony. Proportion as applied to physical things like a painting is usually what we call balance. But integrity is an interesting one. It's that something has the proper number of parts. And this connects all the way back to Aristotle with the idea of function. So if you think of, Aquinas had a very specific thing, such as that we probably are less comfortable with, but so I'll give you his view, and then I'll say how we can apply it now. Take 2 identical dogs. They completely identical. You couldn't possibly tell them apart, except one of them is missing a leg. So one is 3-legged and one is 4-legged. Aquinas would, based on what he says, would have to say that the 3-legged dog is at least slightly less beautiful than the 4-legged dog because it's missing something crucial to its nature. That's where we might not be comfortable with that kind of language today. But where I think we would be comfortable, or where I think we might all agree, is we've all seen a movie where we thought, or listened to a song or something where we thought, that was pretty good, but it felt like something was missing, even if you don't know what. Or that was pretty good, but it feels like there was too much of something. Again, even if you're not sure what that too much or too little are. And so that's the idea of integrity. And we still use the concept in terms of things like structural integrity now. And then the third one is radiance. This might be in some ways the most important of the 3, because you can imagine a symmetrical wall, right? Like a wall that's 18 feet long, like wide, and at the 9-foot mark, right in the middle, there's a line. So it's symmetrical. They're perfectly even, but it's boring. It's not something you would describe as beautiful, but it has symmetry. It has proportion. Radiance, though, there's a metaphorical and a more literal aspect of this. The metaphorical aspect is that the object of beauty, in a sense, shines before your mind. The more literal aspect is that radiance consists of light and color. And this connects with a lot of science. Like, there's a lot of science now that on color and light. And while it's great that the science can confirm and go even deeper and more specific and maybe even quantify some of these things, the basic idea that light and color are part of beauty goes at least back to the 13th century with Thomas Aquinas. So, but now begins the descent into madness. Almost literally, too. So I just want to kind of summarize. I know that was a lot. I went 5 thinkers, and that's only scratching the surface. We didn't even get into half of them, or even a fraction of them. But those are some of the main ones. But to kind of just summarize, the key idea is the ancient and medieval thinkers saw beauty as something outside of their mind, whether it's grounded in nature, the forms, the mind of God. It's not something that human beings determine. It's something that human beings discover. And so one of my big one of the things I've heard a lot when people talk about the objectivity of beauty is the retort I usually hear is, well, who are you to decide? Yes, people that advocate for some sort of objective idea of beauty also have opinions about what things they think are more beautiful. Those are not the same thing, though. The belief in the objectivity of beauty, as these people held, was something that we discover. It's like a goal to hit or target to hit, not something that the human mind determines. So now, Descartes, you may have heard Descartes. René Descartes is famous for, I think, therefore I am, or more accurately, I doubt, therefore I am. He wanted to find something in philosophy that could ground the sciences. That's what he says in the preface of his book, Meditations on First Philosophy. And in this book, it is literally 6 meditations. So it's not the title's not misleading. It doesn't read like a lot of philosophy. Like if you think of some really complicated things, it's more of someone just reflecting, and he goes to a cabin and reflects on various things. Well, he creates this idea that we now call the method of doubt. He says, I'm going to doubt anything that can be doubted. If it can be doubted just for the sake of argument, it's like a thought experiment. Just for the sake of this, I'm going to doubt whatever could possibly be doubted. And so he says, have your senses ever deceived you? Yes. I thought that was my friend down the road, and I ran up and it's like some other person, and that looks absolutely nothing like my friend. I thought I heard a sound, thought it was someone coming into my house, and it turns out something else. I don't even know what it was. So our senses have occasionally been wrong, or our interpretation of our senses have occasionally been wrong. So we're going to remove that. Anything from sense experience is gone, just for the sake of argument. Well, then he does something really weird. He says, well, surely something like 5 + 7 = 12 has to be solid. And then he said, this is the weird part. Well, what if an evil demon has convinced you that 5 + 7 = 12, but it actually doesn't? How could you possibly argue against that? And so what happens here, like when I first read this, I thought this is like, where does this evil demon just come from? I mean, it just, I think where it comes from, and I'll give you just a brief tangent of the history of philosophy. Most people have heard the idea of nihilism, especially if you've seen The Big Lebowski. But we often associate it with Nietzsche, which is fair. But I had the privilege of taking a course that was where we talked about all the nihilism before Nietzsche, and one person thought it began with Occam. If you've heard of Occam's razor, that Occam. Occam was a late medieval philosopher, and the medieval philosophers prior to him all said God is all-powerful, but God is limited by himself, by his own nature. So for example, if God is love, God can't do anything directly that isn't love. Occam thought, well, that's a limitation. God has no limitations. God could decide today that, like beating an animal is wrong, and tomorrow the moral thing to do is everyone has to beat an animal. Like that's what Occam, now whether God would ever actually do that, he may not have actually believed that, but he just wants to, say that. So anyway, I think that's what Descartes has in mind. This is like a couple, like maybe, I don't know, 100, maybe 200 years at the most after Occam. And I think that's the kind of thing he has in mind, and he's trying to wrestle against. Like, what if God is constantly deceiving us? But he doesn't want to say God because he doesn't want to get in trouble. So he says evil demon. Anyway, so he concludes, I'm doubting all of these things. Well, that proves my existence. The fact that I can't doubt if I don't exist. So that's where I doubt, therefore I am comes in. And so I know that's kind of maybe a weird tangential story to tell in this bigger story, but it's important to see how and why it changed and why it shifted focus. It was with Descartes and others around that time period where people started looking more inward. And that brings us to the conversation switches. If you've ever wondered why there's no theory of taste prior to the 18th century, that's why. You don't need a theory of taste if all you're supposed to do is align yourself with God's understanding of beauty or the correct understanding of beauty. You need to, your taste doesn't matter. I don't think that means people didn't have taste or whatever. I just think it means that that wasn't an idea. So in the 18th century, which is famously called the century of taste, people began to debate. Everyone had a theory of taste. That's how the conversation switched from beauty to taste. And so there was, two probably next to David Hume, the two kind of more prominent ideas were that taste is some sort of innate sense, like a sixth sense, or it's a product of reason. That's a whole other topic that I won't get into, but just to kind of explain that. But even the two most famous people for saying beauty and taste are subjective and could not be otherwise are David Hume and Immanuel Kant. But they both believe that reducing beauty to pure subjectivity seems not quite right either. And David Hume even famously says, yes, it's taste is subjective, but no one in the right mind would prefer John Ogilvy to John Milton. Well, here's a test. Have you ever heard of Ogilvy? No, because he wasn't good. So, no, like unless you've read David Hume, you probably, or unless you're like into some really obscure 18th century literature, no one knows who John Ogilvy is anymore. But a lot of people have heard of John Milton, Paradise Lost. So they both sort of question this, but then continuing into the contemporary scene, skipping over the 19th century, where aesthetic taste turned into aesthetic attitude theories, but that's a whole other story as well. The contemporary scene. Artists respond and react to their situations, cultural, political, social, historical. Things were going pretty well in the tail end of the 19th century and early 20th century. And then all of a sudden, World War I happens. And Max Ernst, referring to his works his artworks as a Dada artist, he says, "My works of that period were not meant to attract, but to make people scream." And then after World War II, Barnett Newman, famous abstract painter, said, "Our goal was to destroy beauty." So what followed was the slow removal of beauty, not just from art, but from life. I actually joke that to my art students, like, just go to your studio professors and say your only goal is to make beauty, and just see what they say. And they all laugh at me. To my knowledge, none of them have even dared to even joke with their studio professors on that front. And it seems to disparage it. And so I taught a course once called The Philosophy and Science of Beauty, and I used this book on the left, Nancy Etkoff's Survival of the Prettiest, as the science side, and I used a book by philosopher Arthur Danto, The Abuse of Beauty, for the philosophy side. And Danto is the one that recounts a lot of the things I just said about the artists Barnett Newman and Max Ernst, but he concludes that despite the fact that beauty is no longer necessary for art, not that it shouldn't be done, but it's just not necessary, it's necessary for life. And if you've read Survival of the Prettiest by Nancy Etkoff, she concludes the same thing from the perspective of psychology and evolutionary psychology. I don't think neuroaesthetics was quite a thing when she started, or maybe it was just getting going. And the book was written in 1999. And then Anjan Chatterjee's book, The Aesthetic Brain, they all conclude that beauty is something valuable for us. It's not just something that we add on to. And so it sort of declined. I see this happening in philosophy as well, but beauty was sort of left out for a while. And then in the early 2000s, you start seeing books on beauty pop up again, which is encouraging. And then also the works from science. All right. So now moving on to, so that was your really fast crash course in the history of beauty. There's a lot more to be said, but I think it gets the basic movements. And it's important to see that when people say things like beauty is in the eye of the beholder, that's a recent idea in human history. And I think the problem with it isn't whether or not there's truth to it. It's the problem is that people don't really consider what it means. And I refer to it in my classes as an unquestioned assumption. And the goal of philosophy is to question assumptions and challenge our starting points. And so that's what I often find myself doing with that phrase. Most people can't really define what that phrase even means, usually when I ask. It's sort of some vague idea, like, because we don't agree. Well, we don't agree always on science. We don't agree always on other truth. We don't agree on morality. So does this mean all of these things are out the window too? So, all right. So, what is a basic human good? um, I don't really like that phrase, if I'm being honest, because I think in the realm of philosophy, the word good carries too much baggage. But I use it because that's what some of the people I refer to and think about use. But they also refer to it as a basic reason for action. So in other words, we do things. If I suddenly got up and ran to the other room, because probably it's not some random act. I don't think I'm going to do that just for the record, but if I did, it's probably not some random act. There's probably a reason for why I do it. If you get up, maybe you want to stretch your legs. You don't always think about these reasons. Maybe you want to get a drink of water. Maybe you need to go to the bathroom. At some point, we all have to get up and go to the bathroom. It's just a fact. So to take care of our basic needs, but also I think basic good is a better word. And I think what I like about this way of thinking is that basic goods, I think, fly in the face of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is just sort of, it's a disturbing thing to me to call it a hierarchy. And maybe you'll see why I say that as I continue. So when John Finnis, who I just want to say a brief disclaimer about, if you look up John Finnis, you will see he's a very conservative social Catholic philosopher of the natural law theory camp. Natural law theory gets, I think, a bad reputation because it is so very much associated with very conservative social Catholics. However, the starting point of natural law philosophy, I think, is spot on. And I don't think it leads to that. They have to bring in other things to get to their social conservative positions. I don't think it has to go in those directions. So John Finnis in 1981 wrote a book called Natural Law and Natural Rights. And in it, he asserts that there are 7 basic human goods: life, knowledge, friendship, play, practical reasonableness, aesthetic experience, and, quote, religion. He calls it, quote, religion because, yes, it includes all of the actual religions out there, but it also includes the atheist who, whatever the atheist thinks the ultimate point of life is what he's defining as loosely as religion here. So it's like the meaning of life is sort of the idea. What motivates you in those other ways, not... So Finnis says that aesthetic experience is one of these basic goods, and he writes about 6 sentences about it, and that's it. And so my research has been expanding that for the last, more than a decade. So that's the essence of what a basic good is. And it plays into this idea of intrinsic and instrumental. Like, if intrinsic is something that's done for its own sake, instrumental is something that's done for only the sake of something else. So, like, and most of the goods could be used both ways. Like knowledge, I'm reading this book just because I have to pass this test, but I don't really care about the information. But it's not weird if I say I'm reading this book, even if it's way outside of my normal field of disciplinary knowledge and habits or whatever. I'm reading this book because I just want to know it. I think that's actually a very wise thing, and I think everyone should read outside their discipline as much as possible. So that's sort of the idea of knowledge. But John Finnis does something weird in his book. He says that these 7 goods are self-evident, and one of his students, about 30 years after that book, said, "Is he right? Are these 7 goods? They hold up 30 years later?" Because he kind of says, yes, some sociologists and psychologists agree with me. He kind of doesn't really. I think he might have. There might be a note explaining, like, with some sources, but so one of his students 30 years later tests that, and she compares like the work of other people, and she says, yeah, actually the 7 goods still kind of hold up in psychology and sociology, even people that don't have his natural law or Catholic or otherwise any of his other viewpoints. So he thinks that these are self-evident, and meaning that they can't be proved as the conclusion to a syllogistic reasoning or a more normal logical argument. And so he says what we have to do is create an assemblage of reminders to kind of illustrate these things. So he says there's two ways to do this. What do people actually do? And what would life be like without these things? And so what do? We observe that people spend lots of time, money, and energy setting up their houses or their offices, grooming themselves, buying clothes, buying products, doing all sorts of, having procedures done, doing all sorts of things to look a certain way, to surround themselves. And that's part of the daily life. And then we see when we go into things like travel and otherwise, people spend time, money, and energy traveling all around their state, their country, the world to see things that they believe based on, now we have lots of photos, but, based on testimony of other people that something is worth seeing. And like I have the example of the Grand Canyon and the Taj Mahal here. And so we spend lots of energy doing these things. And so that's one. What do people actually do? And then the other one is, what would life be like without beauty and positive aesthetic properties? Well, we don't have to go far to imagine. Just look at American prisons. They're not pleasant. Reginald Dwayne Betts was part of a panel discussion at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum here in Boston a little while ago. And he without even someone asking about the aesthetics of prison, he says, there's no beauty in prison. But imagine that being your life. Imagine all of the positive aesthetic things that you surround yourself with, all of a sudden tomorrow being gone. So yes, according to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, could you technically be alive? Yes. Why would you want to? Why would you want to exist in that world without positive aesthetic properties and other things as well? So these two things are just ways to suggest to people that aesthetic experience is in fact a basic good. And obviously, we don't have time to go into like much more of a defense than that. So on to part 3. So if that's true, that aesthetic experience is in fact a basic good, well, it must impact our lives in a lot of ways. And one of those, so think about this, if beauty and positive aesthetic properties and features are really important to us, why are they not part of the conversation of lots of things? And I think it's a strange thing for me. And I know that there are exceptions to what I'm about to say, but if you think about spaces for children, they often have really good aesthetics. I mean, they're designed for children. Like they might have cartoon characters on the wall, and we don't necessarily need those in adult spaces. But then when you look at comparable spaces for adults, and you can compare these two waiting rooms, and I deliberately chose ones that, I'm sure there's a nice waiting room out there somewhere, but most of them are not good. Most waiting rooms in hospitals, are terrible places. Like you're about to go in for surgery, and you're they're only thought to have some sort of quote unquote aesthetics in the hospital is a TV playing news about a war. This is a true story too. I won't say which hospital, but anyway. So one place where we don't think is work. If aesthetic experience is a crucial part of what it means to be human, and we spend a majority of our lives at work, why are our offices awful? Why didn't people want to return to the office after COVID? You ever think that it's because no one has fluorescent lighting at their house? And I mean, they may not have consciously thought of that. And obviously the commute, I mean, I know there are other reasons too, like the commute is a big one, but like you could decorate your home office. A lot of businesses gave people some extra money to do that. So they create this really nice space at their house to work in and to go back to office. And I have, example is a guy I know who's a lawyer. He had an office that was overlooking another rooftop, and it was just, ugly pipes and whatnot. And then he switched offices, and now he's overlooking a park, the Boston Harbor, and a nice neighborhood. And he says, I actually get more work done now. I actually can concentrate more with these things. So I've written a book that I'm in the process of editing right now called "Is Your Business Beautiful?" And it's it's divided into these 3 areas: product, place, and people, and how all 3 of these things are affected by aesthetics. And by people, just to clarify, I'm not talking about people's physical appearance. I'm talking about more interactions and communications. One article I read once that I was teaching on was on the aesthetics of healthcare, and I assumed that the article was going to talk about the spaces, and it did. And most of us have probably heard biophilic design and all these things, and lighting that follows circadian rhythms and all that. What surprised me about this article is it said something that I didn't expect, and that is when people talk about like aesthetics being window dressing and not actually having practical value, like it's all about function and efficiency and so on. They've begun to show, and I think the research is still too new to like make a really strong conclusion, but they've begun to show that elegant communication is actually just more effective. And that was the thing that kind of surprised me about this one article that I had read on this. So that's the idea of aesthetics at work. And now what about issues? Climate change. Off the coast of Cape Cod, there was supposed to be a wind farm. The people who might even be advocates of alleviating the effects of climate change fought it. Why? Because it was ugly. Wind farms and solar farms, most people tend to find as ugly. And in fact, there's a designer in Europe. She has, I can't remember her name offhand, but I could get it for you if you want. She is on a mission to make solar collection devices. I don't know if she wants to call them panels, but beautiful, because she says, why do solar panels have to be so ugly? So if we want solutions for practical problems like climate change, then they need to consider aesthetics, because that is what helps people get. That's what helps get people to accept them. It's not the only thing, of course, but it's one of the things. Prison reform. We have a vested interest, regardless of people's opinions about the incarcerated people themselves. We have an interest in making prisons places that people don't want to return. The U.S. has about an 80% recidivism rate. Norway has about 20%. You see this image on the right? That is a prison in Norway. Looks like, yeah, that's a prison. I don't know. I don't think, for their the gravest crimes, I'm not sure if there's a difference. But they have such a low recidivism rate because they actually treat incarcerated people like human beings, and they actually help them get better. And then healthcare, I've already mentioned some of those things, but hospital beds are high commodity. People leave them quicker with positive aesthetic experiences, and especially views of nature. So the last thing I want to mention is taking it more personal. If aesthetic experience is a basic human good and essential for our well-being and our flourishing, as that theory suggests, then when we think about how that idea of aesthetic taste came to, become the metaphor for our opinions and judgments about objects, we think about taste, from the literal sense. So if you put food in your mouth, you will technically taste it, but that's not what we really mean. I mean, it takes people years sometimes to really understand the complexities of certain foods and drinks. Same thing with aesthetic taste. We often accept where we are, like, oh, I just happen to like this kind of music, or I just happen to like this. But what we know is that things that are unfamiliar to us, our brain doesn't fully know how to process it. So we often mistake that for not liking it. And I'll give you an example. Many years ago, in the late 90s, back when they had these little circular things that you insert into something that could play music called CDs, a guy let me borrow a CD of this Indian hand drummer, Zakir Hussain. And I listened to it, and it was so different from anything I'd ever heard. My first kind of response was a little bit jarring. but I trusted this person, so I kind of, I kind of pushed on with it because I felt, well, this person's recommending it, and so, um, and so and then you begin to understand it. And the same thing goes with like subcultures. Like someone that only listens to classical music, to them punk music just sounds like noise because they don't know how to hear it. And so this is the active part of developing our own aesthetic taste. I mean, I think we should be much more intentional. Now, it's true that we probably all have experience of something accidentally coming, like we accidentally come across something like a painting that we've never seen, or a style of music we've never heard of, and we just instantly like it. That happens. But it's also about expanding. Like I'm not a big fan of the idea of good and bad taste. I sort of like the idea of expanded taste. The only problem with that is the opposite would be narrow, and I don't want to say it's narrow-minded. I want to say it's not been given the chance to develop. But I need one word for that so that it doesn't have a negative connotation. But I like the idea of expanded because it's not about better and worse. It's about like we growing and taking an active control of what I call our aesthetic futures. Like, we've changed taste at some point in our life. You may not like some song you liked 10 years ago. You may not like some style of clothing that you liked 10 years ago, and you probably won't again. I mean, as we get older, we know from neuroscience that our brain kind of becomes, say, less flexible. I'm sure that's not the right term, but unless we are actively, working on that. We still need to take an active role in developing our own aesthetic experience. And because why would we settle for what might be a good aesthetic experience now when we could have an even better one? Like, we should want to grow in that way, so we can have as much, we can flourish as positively in our future as we think we are now. And so with that, I would just say, take an active role in your aesthetic development. And that is all I have. The end.